Isn't technology wonderful? Anyway, good evening, folks. Most of you know my name is Tony Millard. I'm the president of Nova Scotia Bird Society. I'd like to welcome you all to the meeting this evening. I'm struggling to leave summer, hence the summery shirt as well tonight. Anyway, first we've got a few announcements. Big one, our AGM is returning to its spiritual home at the Museum of Natural History on Saturday, November the 9th at 2 p.m. in the afternoon. We're going to have an afternoon tea. So the finest teas and coffees from around the world. Cucumber sandwiches, just like the Queen used to have. Okay, probably no cucumber sandwiches. Dainty cakes, cookies, etc. And of course, all the official business for directors, elections, etc., etc. More details will be coming in the coming days. Upcoming events. On Saturday, the 6th of October, we have Birding Blitz via eBird. So get out and see if you can get the highest totals for that day. And then the winner will be 5th and 6th. My IT department is telling me. I do apologize. To get the highest totals, and then the announcement of the winner we made at the AGM. Saturday, the 12th of October, Global Bird Big Day around the world with eBird. Participate anywhere. Will help get big numbers for Nova Scotia, and you'll be a part of the Global Big Day. It's a great team to be part of, and we'll see what we can find. Update on last weekend, we had the large Briar Island weekend. Big thank you to Angie and James for leading walks, etc., and having a good old time. And all you can say about the land birding is hawks, raptors, and raptors. My God, we're never going to forget the amount of kettling birds we had that weekend. It was awe-inspiring. There was also a private pelagic that day. It got a little bit bumpy. Least said about that, the better. But the land birding was unbelievable. And we did get a few good birds on the pelagic as well. Whew. What else have we got coming up? Well, Richard, can you mute, please? Sorry, mate. Thank you very much. Anyway, on to the main event. We're all familiar with birding big years now. Some have done them. Some have done them provincially or just for your patch. Heck, Dorian did it on a bike across the USA. 18,000 kilometers close to. 500 near enough walking miles. That's a lot of travel. A few of you may know or may not, I was an avid cyclist in my youth, racing and touring around Europe. And I'm going to be interested to find out what equipment you're using and that sort of thing, because it still fascinates me. I'm in awe of your dedication for doing it on a bike. And
do you want to set it up so I don't touch the remote and stuff? And I can sit here, or
yeah, could you possibly press mute, please? Thank you. I think we're there. I'm actually in awe and looking forward to hearing the tales of your events, and also how you faced your demons, shall we say, as well. It can be a difficult subject, but I'm really looking forward to it all. So without further ado, I'm going to attempt to share screen, and I can find the right button to press.
All right, I'm going to set this up now.
Not that.
So let's see.
Oh no, go out that. You need to go up here.
The view?
Yeah, and then make host.
I've lost make host as usual. On the buttons. Make host. You have control, Dorian.
Good. So you guys can see this first slide with this funny little blue thing in the mug of beer.
Not yet.
All right. Once the title slide comes up, then I can get rolling. Then I know that you'll be seeing what I'm seeing. Try this as well.
I think you need to press share screen down at the bottom, Dorian.
That would help. Share screen. There we go.
Hey, me giving IT advice.
All right, let's try that. All right. That was probably the issue. Now, can you guys see the slides now?
Yeah, full screen looks great.
All right. I am just going to close that. All right. Well, let's get going. Yeah, thank you guys for having me. It's really cool that I can connect with you from basically just south of San Francisco in California. So I'm 4 hours behind, and it's sunny and whatnot out there right now. So I was birding this morning, and I'll probably go out birding again this afternoon, all on my bike. But today I'm going to tell you the story. This is the title of my book called Birding Under the Influence, and I'm going to explain kind of how I started with birds and then got sidetracked by booze, and then eventually later in my life came back to birds. So I spent a bunch of time kind of setting up why I did this big year. I think that big year people tend to fall into one of two camps. They're either kind of through their professional life and they've made a lot of money and they are retiring and now they have all this time, or they're 20 somethings kind of feeling out what it is they want to do with their lives. And I was kind of in the middle, as you're going to see. So I kind of gave up a lot to go and do this. What's the problem here? There we go. So I started birding as a kid. I found bird watching independently of my two parents, who are very indoorsy. They like museums and dining and history and that kind of stuff and theater. They have no interest whatsoever in the outdoors. But I started birding in my backyard at age 7. And any of you who have been to Ecuador have probably used the Bird Guide to Ecuador written by Robert Ridgely. And so my mom was in the same gardening group as his wife. And my mom was like, oh, I've got this bird obsessed kid. And she's like, oh, Peg Ridgely was like, I've got this bird obsessed husband. So they hooked the two of us up. So Bob Ridgely was my mentor when I was younger, which is pretty cool. And he recommended that I attend these youth birding camps run by Victor Emmanuel. So I attended 4 of those in the course of 4 summers from ages 12 to 16 or so. And kind of by age 15, I had kind of made the decision that I wanted to be an ornithologist. I looked at what Robert did in terms of conserving birds in South America and writing books and discovering new species and said, I can put this kind of childhood compulsion to professional use later in life. And so this was my academic trajectory, and this will become relevant in a second. But I ended up going to prep school in New England. So coat and tie every day, very formal, so on and so forth. I really enjoyed it. So I went to Hotchkiss for prep school. And then when I finished at Hotchkiss, I ended up matriculating at Stanford, and I spent 4 years there, and I got my BS in biochemistry and molecular biology. And at that stage, I was pretty hellbent on being a college professor. I had kind of moved away from birds for reasons that will become clear in a little while. And I really liked the reductionist approach to science. I liked the fact that I could do an experiment with a hypothesis. Ecology at that time was still a lot of counting and statistics. You could never really show causality the same way that you could with doing like reductionist science in a controlled environment. So I decided that I would go and get some more research experience before going to grad school. So I went to Harvard and did some predoctoral research in molecular embryology. Specifically, how does the developing embryo know how does it assign the axial asymmetry? So where does it put its head and where does it put its feet? And kind of by default, where does the embryo put its left and right and front and back? And then the next thing was getting a PhD. So I went to NYU and did a PhD in developmental genetics and molecular cell biology. And there, my thesis focused on cell polarity. So cell polarity is the process through which cells regionalize function. So you are looking at your computer right now, and the light from the computer is hitting your retinal cells. And that retinal cell is receiving that light input on one side and then transducing that signal into your visual cortex in your brain on the other side. So there's a directionality of function. Same thing with an intestinal cell. An intestinal cell absorbs food on one side and ships it to the bloodstream on the other side of the cell. So how these asymmetries are set up within each cell is really important and is relevant for development and disease. And so that's what I worked on in my PhD. So really reductionist stuff, nothing larger than like a group of cells. But in the background of all of this, I had this concurrent substance abuse problem. And so I kind of got involved with alcohol when I started midway through prep school when I was 17. And I fell in love with intoxication the first time that I got drunk. And I from that point out, like every time I drank till I couldn't function, basically. So after I left Hotchkiss, I was at Stanford, and my drinking went from kind of restrained off-campus times at Hotchkiss to constant at Stanford when I had access. There were no rules against it on campus. I could do what I wanted. So I was constantly blacking out, getting hammered 4 or 5 nights a week, starting to experiment more with drugs, with marijuana, mushrooms, ecstasy, so on and so forth. And then once I got into the big city in Boston, I started doing a lot of DJing when I was an undergrad. And I started DJing at nightclubs and promoting parties and hanging out at raves and just doing all the things that you like hope your kids don't do. But I survived that time. And then I actually chose NYU because it was in New York, which was the world's biggest party. And it was easy access to drugs. And so I went from like weekday drinking and weekend drug use to like constant drinking and drug use. So cocaine was a night a week indulgence. I would routinely go from nightclubs to the lab at 7 or 8 in the morning and start working. So it was really out of control at that stage. But what I tell people is that I was just really good at school. And so I knew how the game was played, and I don't need a lot of sleep. And I just got through this despite the fact that I was beating the hell out of myself 4 or 5 times out of the week, 4 or 5 times a week. And so it seems a bit strange to kind of hand wave away the process and the journey that was my sobriety. But hopefully when you read the book, you will understand exactly how tumultuous that process was. I got sober in my last year of graduate school at NYU. So in January of 2010. So I've now been sober for 14 and a half years or so. And as I've learned, an addict has to be addicted to something. Like I can stop drinking, but there needs to be a substitute bone on which I can chew. And so in the vacuum that was sobriety, like my birding interest came back full force. And so I kind of like returned to the childhood state where I was obsessed with birds as soon as I got sober. And so I did well enough in graduate school that I started my postdoctoral fellowship at Mass General Hospital and Harvard Medical School in January of 2011. And that's kind of where this big year story starts to take shape. So my postdoctoral research focused on synapse remodeling. So how over developmental time do neurons modify their patterns of contact with other neurons and thereby change the flow of information through the circuit. So I was specifically interested in how in a condition like autism, it doesn't seem that synapses are pruned properly. Same thing in schizophrenia. So there isn't remodeling seems to be compromised in those patients. And so what are the underlying genetics that dictate the normal developmental process for these circuits? So that's what I was interested in. And I got on this really cool project. Everything looked promising at the outset, but as I got into this project over the first 2 years of my fellowship, I realized that I was following up on some assumptions that were incorrect. I experienced a lot of technical difficulties. These are really tedious experiments there's a lot of signal, there's a lot of static in the system. And so the experiments have to be controlled to be able to see whatever signal to noise there is. I got a lot of conflicting data where one round of experiments, it would implicate gene A, and the next round it would implicate gene B, but not gene A. So a lot of my experiments are uninformative. And then I think the bigger problem is that I was suffering from this fear of failure. When I got sober, I had kind of surrendered the party guy, fun, DJ, freewheeling image and lifestyle. And I kind of put all of my eggs into the science basket. And so I had this very public goal of becoming a college professor. And so if I was not going to follow through on that, I thought I'd be this huge failure. And also I had a big ego. I got caught up trying to be the smartest guy in the room. But there was also all this expectation, like people did expect big things of me and I expected big things of myself. And so I kind of hit this wall towards the end of my second year of my postdoc, starting to question if this was the professional course that I wanted to steer moving forward. And so I felt lost. And I guess I just told you the bottom part of that, so I don't need to go through it again. And so I guess this is appropriate given the storm that's barreling up the Florida coast right now. But in October 2012, this was Superstorm Sandy. And Superstorm Sandy was really big. It wasn't the most powerful hurricane. It was only a class 1, but it was gargantuan. And the wind field reached kind of out of what would be the top right of that picture over to Scandinavia. And so what ended up happening was the wind field was so big that it captured 2 northern lapwings and dropped them on Nantucket. And I had seen northern lapwing in the UK when I was over there visiting my family, but I had never seen one in the US. And as my birding passion had reignited, I became a rabid ABA lister. And so these birds were spotted out on Nantucket. just in the wake of the hurricane, and I was like, I have to get out there to get these to my ABA list. And so you can see in the map here that there's several problems. The first is that you can't drive to Nantucket because it's an island. So I figured I could drive to Hyannis, where there's a port, and then I can hop on the ferry that takes 2.5 hours to get to Nantucket. The next hurdle would be that none of the island taxi service is shut down in the winter because nobody goes out there. It's just residents, and it's not worth their time to run the business. And so I contacted a local bike shop and said, "Hey, will you rent me a bike?" And if the guy running the shop said, "If you're crazy enough to come out here biking in the wake of a hurricane and can put up the $35, I'll rent you whatever the hell you want." So this was how I formulated the plan to go look for these lapwings. And so I got off the ferry, I went to the bike shop, I picked up the bike, and in pouring rain, I pedaled it 5 miles out to the southern end of the island, southern side of the island, and I was able to find the 2 lapwings that had been reported 2 days earlier. Nobody else was there on that day. It was a Friday. I think people were waiting for the weekend, but I was the first of several people who showed up kind of through the day. But I then saw these 2 birds. It stopped raining for about an hour, so I took some pictures, spent some time with them, and then biked back to the dock, got back on the boat, and went back to Boston. And so on the boat on the way home, it got me thinking, like, this felt really different than other bird chases. I hadn't done any biking before this. I rode my bike around campus drunk most of the time at Stanford, but I had no formalized cycling experience. So the bike thing felt really new. And so I started to kick this combination of biking and birding around in my head. And I wondered, like, is bike birding a formalized thing? Are there bike birding trips? Are there bike birding clubs? And then my mind started to wander and really went crazy and wondered, has anybody done a bicycle big year? Because that would be such a cool project. And so I think most of you guys know what a big year is. It's this ultimate treasure scavenger hunt, avian treasure / scavenger hunt, where you try to see as many birds as you can in a calendar year. So from January 1st to December 31st. Competitors in the past have relied on planes, cars, boats. There's even stories of people chartering helicopters, chartering jets, so on and so forth. The most invested competitors might drive 50,000 miles and fly another 200,000. So it's kind of nonstop for the whole year. And when this idea of the bike big year popped into my head, top finishers approached 750 species. So in 2012, that record has since been pushed up and up and up. But just kind of remember that 750 for now, and I will bring that back towards the end of the talk. And I'm sure that most of you guys have seen this silly movie called The Big Year, which was based on the book The Big Year, written by Mark Obmachek. And so that movie came out. The book came out in 1998. Actually, the book came out a bit after that, I think in the early 2000s, and it was made into a movie in 2011. And this ended up being very helpful for me because a lot of people around the country, even non-birders, had seen this silly movie. And so once I got onto America's roads and I said, I'm riding my bike around trying to see how many species of birds I can see in a year, many people were like, "Oh, like that silly movie." I'm like, "Yes, exactly." So this movie kind of primed the system in a way that was really helpful. But in looking at this existing big year model, there are 2 huge problems with it. And the first one is it's not a birding contest, it's a travel contest. He or she who has the most money is going to see the most birds. They can fly across the country to chase rarities. They can get to the most remote places to see birds that other people can't get. They can hire guides. They can charter planes, so on and so forth. There's no mystery who's going to see the most birds. And it's whoever has the most money. And the other problem with this is that it's a lot of fossil fuel consumption. While a plane is public transportation and any one birder's plane flights over the course of the year are not going to be the cause for the polar ice caps melting, I felt it was strange that the community as a whole would champion those who unquestionably had the biggest carbon footprints among us. So I thought that was an inherent contradiction in the big year model that somebody needed to address. And so I started to kick this idea around in my head, and could I reinvent the big year using just a bicycle? Could I use no fossil fuel and still get to enough areas that it would be interesting in the course of a year? And so just as kind of a joke in the planning phase of this, I kind of drew out this, I started to think about how would I maximize the number of species that I was going to get. And I originally thought about starting in the Carolinas or starting in Florida and then kind of doing the southern US, the mountains, and then the western US. But I realized that if I could brave the cold, either at the beginning or the end of the year in New England, I could get 25 or so species. It would be really hard, if not impossible, to get anywhere else. So in putting all this together, this was the route that I designed, and I thought that if I could complete this route and find most to all of the birds along it, I could actually be knocking at the door of 600 species, which would be a nice round number, and about 80% of what people with unlimited resources could find. Because I just told you that at this time, people who did big years, cars, boats, planes, they ended up with about 750. So this was like my imagination. This was kind of what I drew as a naive plan. Oh, this is a talk from the UK. Sorry. So I had that slide in there, but this is also really important. So I told you that I rode a bike around Stanford, but my formalized cycling experience to this point was this slide, was blank. It was 0. So I had never ridden with clip-in pedals. By the time I conceived this adventure, I'd never ridden a bike more than 10 miles at a stretch. So this was a pretty big leap to think that I could ride. What ended up my vision was about 15,000 miles around the US. So I don't know, about 24,000 K is what I envisioned. But despite this glaring lack of experience, I took the plunge. I abandoned my career. I didn't even own a bike at this stage. I bought a bike and I set off, and I just kind of hoped for the best. And so this is what it looked like on January 1st. I started just north of Boston. It was fortuitous because I either had the calculation that would get me to 600 species either had me starting in the Northeast in January or ending in the Northeast in December. And once I plugged all the other kind of time constrained places I need to visit into the equation, it suggested starting in New England would be the more efficient use of my time. So it was convenient that I lived in Boston at the time. So I started about 40 miles north of Boston, near Newburyport, if any of you have been there, or Salisbury. And this is what it looked like on January 1st. And so I'm bundled up. I think that this probably doesn't look too dissimilar from Halifax, with these kind of like old colonial homes, very cold in the winter. So that's what the first day looked like. And my first bird right out of the gate was actually snowy owl. I rode out to this marsh in the dark as the sun was coming up to go look for a short-eared owl, and a snowy owl flew right across the path of my bike as it moved from the beach to the marsh. So that was pretty cool. This is not the actual first bird that I saw. This was about the 4th snowy owl that I saw in the course of this morning. 2000, if you guys will remember, 2013, 2014 was one of these huge invasion winters. So it was the biggest snowy owl invasion winter on record. So I knew I would get snowy owl on the first day. I just didn't think I would get it as my first bird. My second bird that I saw, the second individual bird, was also a snowy owl. And the third individual bird was the short-eared owl that the second snowy owl was chasing. And then the 4th individual bird was bald eagle. So I don't think it's possible to have a better start to a big year than I had in 2014. A couple hours after seeing that snowy owl, I was standing on the jetty scanning through Bonaparte's gulls when this bird flew through my field of view. So this was a southbound black-headed gull, which was really cool. And I was able to get a whole bunch of people who had come out to support me on that morning onto this bird. So that is a bird that I had dog-eared time to look for as I moved south down the Atlantic coast. But it was nice to have it handled right out of the gate. The analogy that I give people is a big ear is like a juggling act, and each bird is represented by a ball. And so at the outset, you're juggling, like mentally juggling 750 balls, trying to figure out how you're going to be able to see each of those. But as you see each bird, then the ball gets pulled, the corresponding ball gets taken out of the juggling act, and then you have more focus available for the balls that remain. So it was great to get snowy owl kind of out of the juggling act, and black-headed gull out of the juggling act, and a whole bunch of other common species that day. So you just want the dominoes to start falling as fast as possible so that you have time to focus on the more challenging birds as the year goes along. I promise I will not take you through this day by day, but the beginning of this was, in my opinion, so interesting that it's worth looking at. So I took a screenshot of the weather forecast, knowing that I'd give a talk about this at some point. And so you can see that the high on the first day, on January 1, topped out, the day started at 10 degrees and topped out at 27. And you can see that it just gets worse from there. So they predicted snowfall at basically about 10 inches. Well, they were way wrong. So I was completely housebound on January 2 and 3. I tried to go out birding, but my eyes froze shut. It was 5 degrees below zero, 25-mile-an-hour of winds. And by the time I woke up on January 4th, after not doing much birding on the 2nd and 3rd, there was 18 inches of snow on the ground. So this plan to start in New England suddenly seemed a really, really bad idea. But when I got going again on January 4th, it was 10 degrees below zero. But I'm cycling through this like winter wonderland as I'm moving from Newburyport down onto Cape Ann, which is a great winter birding spot for gulls and alcids and sea ducks. But I'm riding along the road, and cedar waxwings are flying over, and wild turkeys are running across. And I just had this moment where it's like nobody on earth has experienced anything like this. No birder has cycled through anything like this, I'm sure, in human history. So it was just this unbelievable moment where I was toughing out the conditions, but loving every moment of it. So that's kind of how the Northeast started. I will tell you that I suffered 4 separate snowstorms through the first 3 weeks, 3 of which dropped at least a foot on me. So I was like under snow the entire first 3 weeks. The temperature did not reach above freezing, but for 2 hours in that 3-week stretch. And that January and February of 2014 are still the coldest winter on record in the northeastern United States. So I picked, in some ways, the worst year to do this because it was the coldest, but in other ways, it was the best because if it was easy, the story wouldn't be any good. But as I moved down the Atlantic coast and into Pennsylvania, my family's from Philly, so I spent some time with them as I moved through Pennsylvania. You can see anything coded in green here is a bird that I targeted in the Northeast and that I found. So I missed black-legged kittiwake because every time I went to the beach to go look for that bird, it was snowing. And I couldn't see out to sea. And I scanned a lot of flocks of Bonaparte's gulls, but could never manage to get little gulls. So that was a painful miss as well. And interestingly, even though there were tons of snowy owls around in 13, 14, it was a really bad finch winter. So white-winged crossbill, which often gets into Massachusetts in the winter, wasn't around, and nor was common redpoll. And those were 2 birds that I had to let go. There was just when I saw how few of them were around, I realized I wasn't going to run into those. I was also able to get barnacle goose in Connecticut. So that was one of these, like, I figured if I could get one of those birds out of that group of 5, that would be really nice. So I got off to a really good start. And so by the time I made it to Philadelphia, I was like, I think this is going to work. Like I'm pedaling out of the cold. It's still freezing, but I'm moving in the right direction. I'm moving towards warmer climes. I've figured out how to ride the bike, figured out how to bird in the cold, figured out like a rhythm where each day I get up and pack up my stuff and get on the bike. So as I left my parents' house in Philadelphia, I was optimistic that I didn't know if I could make it the whole year, but I was optimistic that the bicycle as a vehicle was working to some degree. Usually you don't get a lot of snow in Delaware, which is south of Philadelphia, but I rode through there and 5 or 6 inches of snow. And when I went through Washington, D.C., it was still only in the teens. As I said, I didn't see a temperature above freezing basically for the first like 30 days or so. It wasn't until like the beginning of February that I got anywhere where the temperature was slightly above freezing. So the first month was all below freezing. But all that effort was rewarded when I made it to Florida. And my plan in Florida, I came in Jacksonville, which is in like the northeastern part of the state. And I just rode all the way from Jacksonville down to Miami along the East Coast. And then I rode across the Tamiami Trail at the bottom. And then I hit the West Coast where the hurricane is going right now. And I went all the way up the West Coast and then past Tallahassee and then into the Florida Panhandle. So I spent like 6 weeks in Florida, and that was a really welcome break from all of the cold and misery that I suffered in the Northeast. So I got my lifer snail kite in Florida. I'd been to Florida birding previously, but did not see snail kite. And Florida is wonderful for birding because you have birds like purple gallinule and you have roseate spoonbill and you have all the different waders, and things tend to be big, slow, colorful, and tame. So places like the Bocotahatchee wetlands and Green Cay wetlands in Delray Beach and some of the spots down near Everglades National Park. The birding is it's really idyllic. I don't want to say it's easy, but a lot of the birds just present really nicely for photographs. So it's a great photography destination. I was also able to get Lasagra's flycatcher, which is a Caribbean species. This individual bird is funny. A good friend of mine, Neil Hayward, did a petroleum-powered big year in 2013. He was the one who broke Sandy Comito's long-standing record in 2013. And this Lasagra's flycatcher is one of the last birds that Neil saw on his record-breaking big year. And it was really fun that bird stuck around for a couple of months after that. And then I was able to see what was presumed to be the exact same individual when I passed through Florida 3 months later. So that's kind of a nice bit of connection between Neil and me. So basically, I've used most of January, February, all of January, February, and March to get down to southern Florida, and that kind of was the winter phase of the trip, so to speak. And as I kind of rounded up into the Panhandle and then across the little feet of Alabama and Mississippi and into Louisiana, that was kind of the spring phase of things. And there was a big time pressure to get to Texas around April 15th, because I think most of you probably know that a lot of the neotropical migrants migrate back to the US and Canada in this very narrow time window. And if you can hit the time window perfectly, you can it's one-stop shopping for all of the neotropical migrants, at least that nest in the eastern half of the US. So I was able to reach Texas right as I had planned on April 15th, which is miraculous considering the bad weather at the outset and some other maladies that I suffered, like getting hit by a car, which you can read about in the book, and so on and so forth. So I could not believe I got to Texas in the time that I did. And that was great because it was like an avalanche of new birds. So I was able to get black-throated blue warbler, which is an eastern Gulf migrant. Those tend to migrate through Florida and then disperse through the continent from the southeastern US. They don't come through Texas. I found this bird during a storm on April 15th. And it was like the only one that was seen in Texas that spring. And I was able to ride back to the reserve where I had left and round up a whole bunch of people. So everybody who came out, who I told about this bird, was able to see it. And it was nice because I was going to rely on so many people to help me find birds over the course of the year. It was nice to find one for myself and then be able to share it with a whole bunch of other people. One of the birds that everybody wants to see in Texas in spring, it's a bit drab, but it's very sneaky, is the Swainson's warbler. It has a limited distribution in the southeastern US, so it's kind of one of the harder warblers to see. But this same weather event that grounded this black-throated blue warbler also grounded the Swainson's warbler. So that was really helpful to have what was the only fallout of that entire spring happen on my second day in Texas. So I spent about 2.5 weeks bouncing around the Texas coast. So I did High Island, I did Sabine Woods, I did Anahuac for rails and shorebirds and waders. Where else did I go? I went out to the Bolivar Peninsula for shorebirds and terns and so on and so forth. So it was a lot of fun. It was a really nice 2 weeks of a lot of heavy birding and relatively light riding days. But once it was time to leave the Texas coast, I think that the ante was going to be upped in terms of the challenges that I was going to face. To that point in the trip, I had been along the coast. Yes, it was cold in the Northeast, but things were developed. Like there were places for me to shelter if I got too cold. If I didn't think I could make my imagined destination, there was always a motel into which I could duck halfway through the day. It was easy to find food and water. All of that would change when I left the Texas coast and then went west of Austin. As a good friend of mine told me, I almost died of thirst driving across Western Texas. I have no idea how the hell you're going to make it on a bike. And this is because there's very few towns, and there's spaced about 30 to 70 miles apart, and there's absolutely nothing in between those towns. There's no gas station, there's no water, there's nowhere to eat. Like you have to know when you get on the bike in town A that you can make it to town B. Because if you can't, there's nowhere to stop short, nowhere to refuel, anything like that. As you moved west of Austin, it was going to be hot. So between 90 and 100 degrees every day. And the other thing is that while the wind on the Gulf Coast comes from the southeast and offered some assistance in the form of a tailwind west of Austin, the wind switches to come from the southwest. So all of a sudden I was going to be riding into the wind. And so one of the things I did to mitigate these weather considerations was I started riding at 4 a.m. So I rode I-10, Interstate 10 for a good chunk of this. So I'd get onto the highway at 4:30 in the morning and start pedaling for 2 hours in the dark because it's not hot and there's no wind at that time. And then I'd try to get where I was going by noon or so before it got really, really miserable. So that was how I dealt with these Texas challenges. And the reward for that was reaching southeastern Arizona. I guess I got there on May 15th. And that day, the first day that I rolled into the Chiricahuas, I think I saw like 25 or 26 new species for my running tally. That was the most new birds I'd seen on any day since the first day of my adventure when I got 27 or 28 or whatever it was. So like getting to Arizona was this huge reward. So I got all the common birds, things like red-faced warbler, elegant trogon, buff-breasted flycatcher. But more importantly, really started to rack up the rarities in Arizona. So I got common blackhawk, which is a bird I wasn't sure how I was going to deal with. And I just seen Montezuma quail, and this juvenile flew right over my head. So that was one of these like huge sighs of relief of I don't have to invest miles and effort into this specific species because it just appeared along right where I was. I was able to get rufous capped warbler. I got white-eared hummingbird, which can be hit and miss there. I got black-capped gnatcatcher. I just saw absolutely everything. Buff-collared nightjar. I got his herd only. I got all the different owls, elf owls, whiskered screech, western screech, spotted, so on and so forth. So 5 months into this, by May 31st, I'd found 459 species. So that left me 7 months to find another 140. And all big years, any endeavor, like the outset, there's this huge capture of goal resources, right? You see lots of birds on the first day, but then as you go out, like it becomes asymptotic. And so at the end, it becomes more and more difficult to add new species. So I realized that as the year went on, I was going to have to invest like disproportionate amounts of effort into each additional new bird for which I would search. This was really cool. So I had never been through northern Arizona and southern Utah. So once I left kind of Tucson, I rode through Phoenix and then north again on the freeway, on the shoulder of the freeway up towards Flagstaff. And then I kind of cut northeast from there through Monument Valley. And I had seen this stupid movie before. It's actually not a stupid movie. It's a very funny movie. And I thought it would be funny to take a similar picture. So this is one of the few pictures I have of myself. I flagged somebody down on the road and had them take a picture of me. And I use this to illustrate the connection between Forrest and I as related to our followers or our supporters. So Forrest had this like ragtag group of people who were physically following him around the country and kind of lent him accountability and support. I did not have a physical group of people trailing me around, but what I did was I did have this blog that was very widely read in the birding world. And so those people gave me the accountability and the encouragement on the days that I wanted to quit. So there were several times when blog followers, blog people, blog readers would send me encouraging notes or make a donation to the cause for which I was raising money, or just to offer general encouragement. And so having those online followers was a really big part of the adventure. And I felt an obligation and a desire to keep the adventure rolling as much for their benefit as mine. So now you can see that I've kind of gone through, we're in June, we're in that blue line kind of in the southeastern US there. And we're starting to get into July. So I'm starting to move into the mountain phase of this. And riding a bike through Colorado in the summer was just absolutely spectacular. It was one of the hardest things I've done in my life, the vertical gain, riding 5,000, 6,000 vertical feet every day, thin air, gasping for breath the entire time. But it was absolutely stunning. I don't know if any of you have ridden the Durango Silverton Railroad, but this is in the valley above Silverton. So I rode from Durango to Silverton, basically paralleling that railway to get to Silverton. And then I left Silverton and came up this big valley here and took this road over to the right and kind of wrapped what would be kind of through the screen towards you to go over Red Mountain Pass. But Colorado is just amazing. Here's Loveland Pass, which is one of the higher places you can get your car in Colorado. So 3,655 meters. I almost died getting my bike up that. My bike with all the stuff, telescope, tripod, camera, laptop, chargers, hiking boots, tools, extra food, extra clothes. The bike weighed about 75, 80 pounds. So pushing that up over 12,000 feet vertical was hard. This is one of the birds that gave me a ton of trouble. Every time I had looked for it, I had to gain 3,000 or 4,000 feet of elevation, throw my bike into the woods, hide all my stuff, and then go stomping around the tundra to look for this bird. And it took 5 or 6 goes of this over the course of 3 weeks before I finally connected with it. So at that moment in late June, this was like the bird I'd worked hardest for. The day after, I was able to summit this mountain, Mount Bierstadt, and get brown-capped rosy finch. So those were the last 2 birds I needed from the Colorado Rockies when I was there. So that was like an amazing 24 hours. And you can read about how this guy on the left there assisted with my rosy finch quest. His name is Chris Rurik, and we're still in touch. And then once I got out of the mountains, I ended up kind of cutting through southern Wyoming, back into northern Colorado, and then into western Utah or eastern Utah. And the birds that I spent the majority of my summer looking for were grouse. And so in a normal big year, you just fly to Denver. I mean, I run a grouse tour for tropical birding where I load everybody into a van and we'd go see sage grouse one morning and we'd go see greater prairie chicken the next morning and we'd go see lesser prairie chicken the next morning and sharp-tailed grouse the next morning. So it's idiot proof. It's so easy if you go while the birds are lecking. But when the birds aren't lecking, this is what you confront, like these miles and miles of unbroken sage in which the birds are hiding. And so I would have to walk through this sage, clapping my hands, woo, yelling, making my presence as large as possible, trying to flush birds out of there. Because if left to their own devices, these birds don't want to fly and they don't get up and sing like a songbird. So they don't announce their presence. So it took like a week to find sharp-tail. It took a week to find sage grouse. It took another 5 days to find Gunnison sage grouse. It took 4 days to find sharp-tailed grouse. And my views of all these birds were inevitably them flying away at high speed. But I did not try for lesser prairie chicken. That was just too far afield, but I did get greater prairie chicken. I don't have a photo of that one. That's one of the only birds that escaped me all year. But you can see that this is how I saw the grouse, was just them bursting out of the habitat and flying away at high speed. So that was a big thrust of my mountain summer. And so once I got through Colorado and Utah, I went up to Wyoming and got black-backed woodpecker, trumpeter swan, great gray owl, ruffed grouse kind of around Jackson and and then I rode across southern Idaho and then through northeastern Oregon. And then I had some extra time on my hands. I was moving better than I thought I would. So I expanded my route up towards the Canadian border. So I made it to within like 15 miles of the Canadian border in northern Washington. And that extension, it was like an extra 700 miles of riding that I didn't anticipate at the outset. But that netted me spruce grouse, which was a bird that wasn't on my radar in the planning phase, and also boreal chickadee, which was another bird that I kind of conceded. So as the year went along, what I discovered was I had greatly underestimated my cycling capacity. And so as you will read about in the book, as an addict, it's impossible for me to say, okay, I see a path to 600 species. This is becoming clearer. Let me just finish my appointed route and I'll get to 600. Kind of at about this time in the year, my mindset went from, let me get to 600 to I have to get every single possible bird in order for this to feel like I'm doing it properly. And so I started in the second half of the year to push myself more and more and more. And in fact, put my original goal of 600 species in jeopardy as a result of doing that. Every time I expanded my route out to get another bird was a chance that I could injure myself or something could go wrong. So understanding the addict's mentality of there's no such thing as like enough, like 15 beers was never enough and 600 birds wasn't going to be enough. And so I just kept going on both fronts. So after so this was the route to 600 species that I described earlier. Originally, I was going to come across like where it says August, I was going to come across northern Oregon. But as I just told you, I went all the way north of the Canadian border and then kind of through Seattle and then down coastal Washington into coastal Oregon. So I got to spend most of the fall in Oregon and California, and that was fantastic. It's so beautiful out here at this time of year. It's really the West Coast summer. It's when there's not much fog. It's sunny. It's warm. It's beautiful. This was at Haystack Rock, which is in Cannon Beach in coastal Oregon. That's where I got tufted puffin. They nest on that big pyramidal rock right there. Moving south, I went through the redwoods, which was spectacular. I kind of traversed most of Northern California to the Golden Gate Bridge. So this was kind of an iconic photo. I'm much skinnier there than I am now. But you can kind of get an idea of like how I had my scope and tripod strapped to my bike. And my then girlfriend, now wife, made this bikingforbirds.blogspot.com license plate. So that was nice, like shameless self-promotion as I rode around. But that gives you an idea of my kit. Half Moon Bay is a place that I now spend a lot of time through a number of different circumstances. My wife and I ended up moving just south of San Francisco, and I do a lot of pelagic birding from Half Moon Bay, and a bunch of my friends live there. But during my big year, produced some really, really good rarities. So I was able to get Pacific golden plover there. I was also able to get red-throated pipit there, and both of those birds required lengthy backtracks over ground that I had already covered to go back and see. So you can read about that. That was just like painful, riding the same miles like over and over again as birds kept showing up behind me. The Pacific coast in the fall is just spectacular. It's just amazing. Big Sur, there's a reason that like all the car commercials are filmed in Big Sur, because when you show the Ford Focus driving along this beautiful coastline, all of a sudden everybody wants to buy the Ford Focus. Southern California delivered. I was able to get yellow-green vireo, an ancient murrelet in San Diego. Ancient murrelet was a bird that was nowhere near, none of these birds were on my radar. Yellow-green vireo is a vagrant in California. And the murrelet and there's gull, rest in peace, I thought would be I'd be moving south further than they would. And if they get to Southern California, it's usually in like December, January, not August. So I never really had those two birds on my radar. But I ended up getting both of them, which is pretty cool. And then this is probably the single best birding story of the whole year. I was birding the Salton Sea, and a friend of mine called me and said, I just found a rufous-backed robin in 29 palms. That's up at the end of that blue line, the top end of that blue line where it says 73950 in Ave. At that moment, I was 150 miles from where that bird was. And I said, thanks, man. I'm not riding 150 miles for one bird. So I spent the remainder of that day birding the Salton Sea. And the following day, and he called me back and he's like, dude, this bird is coming to a pond that's surrounded by fruiting palms. And I'm thinking like, okay, now I have 2 data points. The bird has been there for 2 days. It's tired, it's lost. Rufous-backed robin is endemic to Western Mexico is where it usually lives. It's tired and it's lost, and it has food, it has water, and it has shelter. This bird could hang in there. And so I made the ill-advised decision that I was going to chase this bird. So this would be 300 miles out and back for one bird. So that's the distance, like in this talk in the UK, but that's the distance from Boston to Philadelphia, or from Chicago to St. Louis, or from Vancouver, British Columbia to Portland, Oregon. So that's how far I was riding to potentially add one new bird. It wasn't that if I made it, it was going to be there. The chase was going to take 3 days. So the bird had to stay 2 more nights after I decided to do this. But fortunately, it did stay. And this was like another bonus bird. So I ended up, by the time I rode, I think it was like 116 miles on the first day and 111 on the second and 80 something on the third. I came back to the exact same hotel I had been at 3 nights prior. So I biked 304 miles. And I had the bird, but I hadn't moved an inch in my pointed direction, which at that point was going east back towards Texas. So that's a really good example of, I could see that I was going to get the 600 species at this stage, like months before this, but like I just couldn't say no to chasing this. And it's ultimately like these kind of chases that taught me the most about myself, because I was pushing myself so hard. I'd venture to say nobody in the history of the world has worked physically harder to see one bird than I worked to see this bird. As I passed through Arizona, I was exhausted. When I got back to Arizona, it was also the first time that I was riding over ground that I had seen earlier in the year. So the novelty was sucked out of things at this stage. I was exhausted. My bike was starting to break down. My body was starting to break down. But I was able to get Sinaloa wren, which to this point in the trip was the rarest bird I had seen. This was only the 5th US record. And then I thought the kind of the westbound transit of Texas was going to be the hardest part, but it turns out it was the eastbound. This was really bad. The polar vortex thrust sub-freezing temperatures onto New Mexico and Western Texas. I had no gloves, I had no hat, I had no warm stuff. It was freezing as I was riding through Western Texas. It was miserable. A lot of headwind. It was just really, really hard for those 2 weeks as I moved from Patagonia to Sonora. But then once I turned south towards the Rio Grande Valley, I started to pick up new birds, things like green kingfisher, olive sparrow, long-billed thrasher. And then the birding really heated up when I got down to the Rio Grande Valley, which is unsurprising given how many good birds are there. I spent 2 weeks kicking around the Rio Grande Valley. I got white-colored seed eater on Laredo, group-billed ani, tropical parula, like all the stuff you would hope to see down there. Aplomado falcon, ferruginous pygmy owl. I even got hook-billed kite. That bird has become more common in the last decade, but when I got it in 2014, it was still a really, really rare bird. So that was one of my best gets. But the best bird I got on the whole trip was this one. I was birding at Estero Llano Grande in Weslaco on Thanksgiving, and a bunch of us found this strange bird, and we didn't get photos of it at the outset, but we thought it was a red-legged honey creeper, and so we spent the whole afternoon trying to relocate it. We eventually did and got photos, and this was later with a bunch of administrative delay from the American Birding Association, accepted as the first North American record of red-legged honeycreeper. So it's pretty cool that I actually got to 600 species on this morning with the addition of least grebe. And then later in the afternoon, we found this red-legged honeycreeper, which ultimately proved a North American first. So that's another bit of trivia. I don't think anybody else has ever secured a North American first record on a bike. And so I wrapped up in Texas. I rode back up the coast towards Rockport and got whooping crane. I joined a yellow rail banding expedition in Freeport, Texas. So that gloved hand there is actually wrapped around a yellow rail that I'm helping to band. It looks like I'm about to eat the thing. I can promise you I did not eat it, and I did return the rail to the wild unharmed. And then I rode up towards Dallas, and I got Harris's sparrow. And I told you that I missed Little Gull in the Northeast, but I redeemed that miss outside of Dallas on White Rock Lake, like in the last week of the year. And then the last bird I got was Smith's longspur, which was just outside of Dallas as well. And that was number 615. The honeycreeper, when it eventually counted, ended up as six. Well, Egyptian goose and muscovy, I didn't count them in Florida when I went through there, hoping that I would get like a wild muscovy. And Egyptian goose was made countable after I saw it, but it was made countable in the year that I did my big year, so I could count that retroactively. So Smith's longspur was 615, muscovy was 616, Egyptian goose was 617, and the honeycreeper, when it finally counted, was 618. So that's what I ended up with. So this is what I told you was like my naive imagination at the outset to this adventure, right? And this is the route that I actually biked. And you can see that they are remarkably similar. So I think that this is where my background basically as a genetic engineer shines through, in that I thought of every eventuality, and I really thought about timing and pace, and I'm really good at this kind of problem solving and anticipation. And so there wasn't too much that I left to chance. And as a result, the adventure went almost to script. I like to say this is why I'm a really good tour leader, because I think of every eventuality, and I'm thinking hard about like, how are the dominoes going to fall through the course of the tour? So I think that like scientific approach and engineering mindset actually really benefit me when I'm running tours, because I don't leave things to chance. As you can see, if I can navigate the country for a year on a bike without leaving too much to chance, a tour is no problem. So these are the numbers when it was all said and done. I biked 17,830 miles. I kept track of some of my walking. So I walked about 500 miles. I'd probably say you could tack on another 300 or 400 that I walked just screwing around, looking for birds that I didn't chart. I ended up with 618 species. I raised 49,000 US dollars for bird conservation. I suffered 34 flat tires in the course of the year and got very good at changing them. And one of the best things about being on a bike for a year is that you can eat whatever you want. Absolutely anything. If I woke up in the morning and I wanted a pint of Haagen-Dazs for breakfast, that's what I ate. And if I wanted a second one later in the afternoon, I had it and didn't think twice. So it was really cool to be able to eat whatever I wanted for that year. And birds are only part of the adventure. I think that this big year, more so than any other, there's the contact I had with birders, but also with the general public. So I met a lot of really interesting people. A lot of what I write about in the book, there's not as much like I saw this bird and I went here and saw this bird and I went there and saw that bird. There's a lot of like, these are the people that I met while looking for birds, or that took me into their house, or that hit me with their car, or whatever, what have you. So the people I met are a huge part of the story. And I read a lot about how in hearing their stories, I kind of redefined my notions of happiness and success. So the people were a huge part of this. The physical and mental challenges of this cannot be overstated. This, like, the birding was hard, the cycling was hard, and the hardest part might have been the logistics. I needed to know the wind and weather at any given moment. And I also needed to know the wind, and it's like, this is crazy to think about. I needed to know the weather 2 days ago. Like, if I'm biking through an area on Wednesday, I needed to know the area, what the weather did 2 days before that. And yet, why is that? Well, if there's a dirt road that I'm planning on riding and it rained 5 inches 2 days before I'm going through there, that dirt road is a mud road. And the 30 miles that I was going to ride on that dirt road would feel like 100 in the mud road. So I literally had to account for everything. And like, if I got to a town and the motel was booked, it wasn't just get back on the bike and ride the next 60 miles. Like, I had to make sure that all the dominoes fell, and they did. I never got caught without a place to sleep, without a place to eat. And so all these things together gave me this great sense of personal triumph. It was a really amazing adventure. And what this taught me is that crazy ideas are good ideas. When I cooked up this idea, my boss, my parents, everybody that I knew, minus one person he will read about, said, this is a terrible idea. This is totally crazy. You've got a great gig. You're going to end up as a professor at some fancy school. So what I learned is that if you pitch an idea to a room full of people and everybody says, oh, that's a really good idea, that idea sucks. What that is that's a safe idea that people can get their head around. You need half the people in the room to tell you that you're full of shit and that you're crazy, because that idea is then good enough. They can't get their head around it yet, or it hasn't been tried yet, or it's novel. So this is what I mean by crazy ideas or good ideas. You need people to tell you this is impossible, you're crazy, in order to make something worth doing. If it's easy, it's not worth it. And so out of this came this like new identity and a new purpose. And so I've now kind of worked on my bird photography and now lead birding and photo tours, doing the guiding thing. I've done a lot of ecotourism consulting in Latin America, helping governments develop their own land for ecotourism, and also kind of market their product and identify areas that should be conserved, and so on and so forth. I've worked as a travel writer with the publication of my book. I'm an author, and apparently now I am a public speaker as well. So I've gone from being this like myopic lab rat into this multi-dimensional but bird obsessed person. And I think that that's a great metamorphosis. And so I think that the coolest thing about this is that birding is my longest personal thread. And so there I am as a 12-year-old pinhead at Victor Emmanuel's Camp Chiricahua. And there I am, actually not too far from you guys. That's Cape St. Mary's in Newfoundland. So birding is just this thread that has run through 40 years of my life, longer than drinking, longer than my marriage to my wife, longer than my scientific career, longer than my substance abuse career, right? So birding is like the rock of my being in that respect. So with that, I will finish. This is all of my personal info. My website is doriananderson.com. That has info on like speaking gigs, tours. It has some photography there. It links you to my photo website. My email is really easy. It's just dorian.birds@gmail.com. For those of you on Instagram, I'm at dorian.anderson.photography. I work for Tropical Birding. And there's the book. And I encourage you, if you like the talk, the book is way better than the talk because it's not as frantic. And it's a bit more life and a bit less birds in that respect. But I think I give you an idea of how that flow will go on the talk today. So with that, I'll end, and I will take any questions you guys have. Like anything is fair game. So you don't need to be shy. So that's that for right now. And thank you for having me.
Okay, folks, you heard what Dorian said, so hit him with some questions. Please.
Dorian, I just wanted to say thank you very much. I actually received your book as a Christmas gift, and it's probably it's probably the book I've ever read the fastest, and I read a lot of books, and I flew.
Oh, that's good to hear. Thank you very much.
I flew through this. I really enjoyed your story. I myself have a long-standing struggle with sobriety. And it's always interesting to hear people's stories, and I just think that your story put in this book, it just was really inspirational and a totally new perspective on things. I relate to birding a little bit myself in the same way, where my escape is out in nature and birding. So I really appreciated the words that you put together here, and we actually used your section on Arizona to design
excellent.
our own trip. So
cool.
we totally literally followed you and your path around Arizona for our trip that we did this year, which was really cool. We had a great time and followed a lot of key things from you. Now my Rufus Back Robin story is not nearly as good as yours, but I was really proud to get one in Arizona. Considering I was next to a guy who had tried over 8 times and failed and was not very
wow.
I came back with photos.
the nemesis bird for that guy, yeah, for sure.
Totally. So I just wanted to, Kyle was the one who reached out to you to do this talk, and I really want to thank you for your time and just tell you how much I appreciate you doing this, having a chat with us, and how much I really enjoyed the story, your book, your story.
Yeah, thank you so much, and I'm glad. It's nice now that the book is out in the birdosphere, right? That people are reading it, and and then contacting me. Like I get so stoked when somebody reads the book and wants to have they're like, you know what, like I want to get other people fired up about this book. I'd love to talk to this guy and kind of like hear what he has to say that wasn't in the book and so on and so forth. So it's really, I love doing these things. I mean, this is the best part about birding is the community. It's no matter where you go, like I know that I can move to anywhere in the US, even the crazy places in the US, and I can find birders with whom I share a fairly high like degree of overlap in terms of mentality, right? And they're going to be warm and they're going to be welcoming and they're going to be funny. So the community aspect of this is awesome. Just being able to liaise with so many different people, and that's what this adventure has allowed me to do. And I think that's the best part of it all. Is now these after pedaling that bike around for like 365 days in a row, like the windfall of that is now I'm now better connected in the community that means the most to me.
Awesome.
Any other questions, comments?
Give us a brief overview of your bike, would you please, mate?
Oh yeah, so I used a Surly I guess disc trucker, which was like the classic steel frame touring bike. I tell people it's the Honda Civic of bikes. Like it's heavy and it's slow, but it uses all generic parts that are easy to fix. It doesn't have any of these like fancy whiz bang shifters built into things. It has like bar shifters. I mean, the bike is indestructible. I fell on snow and ice several times. I got hit by a car, and in several moments of weakness, I had adult temper tantrums and like threw the bike off the road. I mean, the bike like got really beat up, and the only thing it suffered over the course of the entire year was one broken spoke and one my rear derailleur cable snapped. That was a bitch because I had to ride like 80 miles basically in 3 gears. Fortunately, it was relatively flat, but like the bike was indestructible, and I was out riding it this morning. I guess the bike has probably upwards of 35,000 miles on it. I still do all of my biking in the Bay Area when I'm home, which is not much these days, on my bike. So I was out, I mean, all the last 4 days. I rarely drive to bird around here, but like with the panniers and everything, like I said, it weighed 75, 80 pounds. So it was a non-trivial amount of weight. Let's put it that way.
I've ridden bikes, heavier bikes many years ago, up and down the Alpine passes and camping, and yeah, you feel the weight going up those
Right.
hills. But
I joke with people that in some ways, when I was drinking, I was beating the hell out of myself at night and then using the day to recover. And then I was on the bike, it was the exact opposite, where I was beating the hell out of myself during the day and then sleeping to recover. But I mean, there is something, and I try to get into some of the psychology of like what I as an addict need to feel whole. Like I'm not like being content is a difficult thing for me. Like I need to feel constant challenge. I don't sit still well. Like I don't drink coffee. I only sleep about 5.5 hours a night. Like I'm so wired all the time. And I have to I now know that like I don't get a choice about being an addict, but I get a choice as to what I'm addicted. And so being addicted to birding and cycling and photography is way better than being addicted to alcohol and marijuana and cocaine. So it's just that's where I put the effort nowadays, is into those things which are better for me than what I was doing to myself previously.
would you do it again?
No, not because I didn't enjoy it. Several reasons. One, I actually don't think I got so lucky that year. Like I chased so many birds and I missed so infrequently. I don't think, even with like the new birds that have been added to the checklist, I don't think, knowing what I know now, I could do as well as I did in 2014. Two, my wife would not give me another year. She is integral to this story. Like I think that like my wife, my then girlfriend, now wife, is like she's the reason I got sober. And she was the one person who's like, you need to leave your career to go take this bike trip, and you need to do it right now, and I'll wait for you. So without her encouragement, I don't know if this would have ever happened. So she's a really big part of this story. So for those of you who are like interested in romance and relationships, like that is in there as well. So I can't remember the point I was trying to make with that. It turned to my wife, and that's good because she's really important and she's awesome. So, well, I wouldn't do it again. And if I were to do another cycling, I would try to go somewhere different. Like I think it would be very interesting to cycle through Central America. I think given like some of the immigration problems that the US is having and some of the really outright racist things, that certain stupid political commentators have said about Central and South America. It'd be really interesting to ride my bike from Panama to like the Texas border, for instance, and bird along the way, but also take people like in the form of a video blog or an Instagram account through these countries where I've already been. I've been to El Salvador, I've been to Honduras, I've been to Costa Rica, I've been to Panama, I've been to Mexico. Like I've been all these places, but it would be cool to show people these aren't quote unquote these shithole countries as they've been dubbed. So if I were to do another bike trip, I don't know if I would do it in the US. I think that I would do it, I would certainly go international and try to use it as a way to build international community. One of my ideas, you guys are all Canadian, so one of my closet ideas is actually to ride across Canada campaigning for Canadian citizenship if it gets too crazy here in the States. So I would actually like basically try to tap into the Canadian media engine and be like, I'm going to ride my bike across Canada, bird watching and raising money for Canadian conservation. Oh, and oh, by the way, I would also like to become a citizen here because it's too crazy down here. So that's my escape plan if all else fails down here.
Do you have
So
a favorite state where you like to bird?
I don't know. I mean, I have birded in all 50 states now. I've spent the least time in Alaska. I will say that. I think that if I were to spend more time in Alaska, I think I'd fall in love with it. I will say California is awesome. Where I live is arguably one of the best birding places in the country. It's never too hot. It's never too cold. I can go pelagic birding. I help on the pelagic boats here as a spotter. The habitats change really quickly. On my bike from my house, with the addition of Grace's warbler on Monday, I have 353 species of birds going out and back from my house over the course of the last like 6 or 7 years. There are probably people who are on this, like that's probably higher than like people's like Canada lists or like a state list in the US. So like where I live right now is really, really good for birding. I do really like birding. I mean, I like birding in Arizona. Arizona is really awesome. The Rockies are really awesome. And I do have a soft spot for New England as well. But I like getting everywhere, and I've been fortunate to get to a lot of places. Anyone else? We done?
There must be some more questions. I'm amazed.
What was the biggest dip on the trip? What was the biggest bird that you thought you had, but you just didn't get it?
So there were a couple. The black-legged kittiwake was a big one because that's pretty easy in New England in the winter. You need basically a northeast wind to blow them in a bit to several different places where you can see them from shore. But because that winter was so ridiculous, every time that I went out to the beach to go look for that bird or to the jetty, like I was staring into a wall of snow. So the weather cost me that bird. I looked really hard for mangrove cuckoo in Florida, like so unbelievably hard. I was there in February and March, which is pre-breeding, so I was playing tape. But the birds don't get really territorial until like late April or like mid-April, so I was too early. Interestingly, I saw a mangrove cuckoo, but it was being banded by somebody else, and so I decided not to count that bird, even though the rules dictated that once it's free flying, I could count it. I hadn't done any of the work to find that bird, and I decided that the integrity of the birds on my list was more important than the number of the birds on my list. So I let mangrove cuckoo go when I could have counted it. Like I touched it, I held it, and watched these people let it go. And then I left a couple of birds on the Texas coast. Like I didn't see mourning warbler, I didn't see alder flycatcher, and I didn't see black-billed cuckoo, some of the later migrants. But I ultimately decided to fold those 3 because I was so scared about moving across Western Texas that I thought the time would be more valuable. And as it turned out, like there were like a dozen birds that I found in the course of the year that if I had been 1 day later, I would have missed. So folding those 3 birds to put myself onto a different time trajectory ultimately netted me more birds than it cost me. So those are the kind of like cost benefit analyses that you had to do along the way. But I'd say mangrove cuckoo and black-legged kittiwake are 2 birds that I expected to find, but didn't. And then after that, like after I left the Texas coast, I literally found every single bird, rarities included, that I looked for, like all the grouse, the rufous-backed robin, like everything that I looked for after that. So I batted like 1,000 after that like May period. So yeah, I just don't think I could replicate that even knowing what I know now if I were to do it again.
Perfect planning got good results.
Yeah. And I think that that's one of the things I realized is that in a normal big year, the way that it's done is like you basically just drive around and or sit by the phone waiting for somebody to call, being like, "There's this rare bird here," and then you go there. But
on the
so
Florida Keys, I think, wasn't it?
there's no path to a normal big
So-
ear. There's like general places you have to be. But one of the
think
things I realized about the bicycle was if in
Yeah, so it
fact
would have
there
been
is
on the
one
Florida
best route
Keys.
to ride, and if in
Yeah,
fact I identify and
yeah, we
ride
went to the
that
Dry
best route,
Tortugas
then
and then
anybody
came
who
back,
comes along
yeah.
after me is necessarily
Yeah.
has this
I do
blueprint,
have a question
which
for
makes it
him,
a bit
actually.
disingenuous. So I think that there was a huge incentive to be the first person to do this. And I think that if I were to do it again, I don't think I would change the route that much. I think I could ride a bit further, but like fundamentally, I think I nailed the route, and that was like 90% of it. So
Any more questions for anybody? Anything in the chat? No.
Did you photograph every bird that you saw, or were there some that you were unable to photograph, but you were able to describe them so that other people believed you with every
yeah.
bird that you saw?
So I think that one of the things I really focused on was, like I just said, like in letting, I think that people trusted me. Because I did try to photograph everything, like the birds that matter. Nobody's going to give me a hard time about black-capped chickadee or semi-palmated sandpiper or eastern meadowlark. Like I didn't bother photographing those birds. I have too many other balls in the air to worry about photographing everything. But like all the rare birds that I saw, I photographed. The only bird which I wish I'd had a picture of, because the circumstances under which I found it were just so unbelievable, was the greater prairie chicken. And like I was in like the single best place in the world, like in the country, to see that bird. And so it makes sense that like I would have flushed it eventually. So that wasn't unbelievable in that respect. But yeah, I really made an effort to photograph everything that mattered, and I was really cautious with my ID. So for instance, something like western meadowlark, I didn't bother counting western meadowlark until I was like well into its range, right? Because I knew that bird would be there for me. Same thing with things like glaucous winged gull. You want to get a pure one. You want to make sure you don't have a hybrid. And so if you're just patient and you wait and you get more into the bird's core range, then there's like less ID problems. So I think I did everything that I could so that nobody questioned my sightings. I've not had anybody question my sightings, which is good. I think that it's the same story as anything, that it takes a lifetime to build credibility and only a second to lose it. So the fact that nobody has questioned me or called me out, I think speaks highly to the care that I took to identify everything and photograph what I could. So
Thanks. Just a comment. I've just started reading Neil Haywood's book on his big year, and so now I know what I'm going to read next, and it'll be yours.
Oh, excellent.
It was a fabulous talk.
Cheers. Thank you very much. We all set? We done?
We have no more questions, and on behalf of everybody, thank you very much for a fascinating talk. You probably see a surge of sales of your book in the next few days.
Yeah, that would be great. You know, it's funny. This is one thing I don't have like constant access to the sales numbers in the book, and that's kind of a good thing, because I'm already caught up with like my county lists and how many likes I get on Instagram and how many miles I'm riding. The last thing I need in my life is like another metric. So it's just kind of nice to like trust that people are buying it. And I think the important thing is that people are enjoying it and they're reading it. Like when I originally dealt with the publisher, I gave them the manuscript. It was like 96,000 words. And they lopped out like almost 10% of it. And I'm like, oh my God, it sucks to lose like 10% of the writing and like a bunch of good stories and things. But the feedback I'm getting is, oh, I sat down and I just read it in one hit. And so it's better to leave an audience wanting more than it is leaving them with too much that they don't get through, right? So I think the book is an easy read in that respect. And it's nice because the feedback has been overwhelmingly positive. So I haven't read any. You get a couple of, you always get, no matter what you do, you get a couple of reviews. It's like, this book is total rubbish. Like, this just smacks of privilege that he could ride away for a year. So you get these reviews. You just have to roll with them, right? So, but the reviews from the people who matter seem to be positive at this stage. So it's good.
That is fantastic. Well, again, thank you very much from all of us. It's fascinating. We'll get this up on the YouTube in the next few days. So thanks again to everybody.
Yeah, cheers.
And have a great evening and everybody, there's still some migrants out there in Nova Scotia, so get out there and find some more birds.
Yeah, hopefully. And then hopefully, if I'm in Halifax at some point or anywhere in Nova Scotia, I can liaise with some of you guys in person. So I might reach out if I move that way in the future.
No problem at all. Thank you very much indeed again.
All right, guys. Cheers. Thanks so much.
No problem. Have a great evening, everybody.
Yeah. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye, guys.